Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's an honor for me to rise in the House today to speak on Bill C-100, but I want to start my remarks recognizing that we're ending the session shortly, and this could very well be my last speech in the 42nd Parliament. That will no doubt delight my Liberal friends, but if they stay tuned to listen to the content of my final remarks, they will have no delight because it's outlining their failures. But I want to also send a special thank you to a couple of exceptional Canadians, Dr. Dave Stevens and Dr. Bill Plaxton in Kitchener-Waterloo. I've been away the last week with my wife having surgery, and she was in the hands of those amazing medical professionals at Grand River Hospital. And I want to thank them, and I want to thank her for allowing me to come and speak tonight on NAFTA. I've been trying to help at home a little bit this last week. We all in this House rely on exceptional spouses, partners, and families, Madam Speaker. And if this is indeed my last remarks of this Parliament, I think all of us don't thank our family enough. So I love you, Rebecca, and I love my family, and the sacrifices we all make in this House leads to reflection at this time of year. So it's been good for me to spend that time with my wife, who is my partner in this adventure, and I want to thank Dr. Stevens in particular for his exceptional care. Hear, hear. Hear, hear. So, Madam Speaker, after that brief coming together in the House, I will now proceed to upset my Liberal friends in discussing C-100. Back to my normal approach. And I hope a lot of Canadians are watching. I doubt they are, but I will push this out because we have to actually break this narrative that the government has approached the U.S. trade relationship and NAFTA renegotiations in any form of strategic fashion, because that has not been the case, Madam Speaker. Much like almost every foreign relations approach under this Prime Minister, we have suffered, Canada has suffered, our sectors have suffered, employers, job creators, employees have suffered because the Liberal Party always puts the Prime Minister's brand and their own electoral fortunes ahead of the national interest. Nothing highlights that more than the famous state visit to India, Madam Speaker. But if you look at all the strained relationships Canada has around the world right now, we've never had so many, Madam Speaker. Almost all of these diplomatic entanglements are attributable to the Prime Minister's own approach, style, and obsession with his image and electoral prospects. We saw that with photographs and things from the India trip, but we've also seen it in flawed trade relations with China, where we're in the biggest dispute since we had relations with China in the 1970s, Madam Speaker, with Saudi Arabia, with the Philippines. Countries like Italy has imposed tariffs on Durham wheat, Madam Speaker. We are losing track of the number of countries that right now have a serious problem with Canada on a trade, on a security, or in other relations because of this Prime Minister and his government. So as much as I have some admiration for the Minister, the Global Affairs Minister, Foreign Affairs Minister, she is presiding over probably the worst period of modern diplomatic relations of Canada, Madam Speaker, and I don't think 10 more magazine covers of Maclean's will correct that record. Nothing should concern Canadians more than the situation with NAFTA, because our economy relies, 2/3 of it, on trade with the United States, Madam Speaker. And I've said many times, in fact, Canada became lazy for the last half century, relying on the fact that we lived just north to the largest, most voracious free market economy in the world. And in the post-world cycle, Canada traded, produced, we were drawers of water, hewers of wood for the largest market just south of us. And until really the Harper government, we didn't look much beyond our shores to enhance free trade and really develop partnerships to diversify our trade relationships. We were so reliant. But we were also pioneers in free trade. The Harper and Mulroney governments, Madam Speaker, and even going back to Pearson and the Auto Pact of the mid-1960s, where there was actually free trade in automobiles, Madam Speaker, for the first time between two modern industrial countries, where an automobile in Oshawa assembled by people like my father and his colleagues that worked at Oshawa when I grew up there, Madam Speaker, or in Windsor, or in Oakville, or in Sainte-Thérèse, Quebec. That automobile was considered assembled and was considered just the same as if it was assembled in Michigan. And over the subsequent decades, we saw a Great Lakes free trade basin in auto. It was actually the epicenter of the global auto industry, Madam Speaker, where with just-in-time manufacturing, a part could be made in Aurora, put on final assembly in Oshawa, and 70% of the vehicles produced in our Ontario auto plants were for sale in the United States anyway. So our free trade with the United States was built upon the auto industry. I say that for two reasons, Madam Speaker, because representing Oshawa and that industry and the retirees and the workers there now is a priority for me. The second reason I say that, Madam Speaker, is it should trouble Canadians that Minister did not mention auto industry in her priority speech on NAFTA, despite the fact that their best friend Jerry Dias is on the NAFTA advisory committee. I was pushing for auto to be a priority, where Jerry Dias was applauding Trudeau, or pardon me, Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister, for an agenda that did not mention the auto industry. Let's do a recap, Madam Speaker. President Trump was elected, and before his inauguration, before he was even president, this Prime Minister volunteered to renegotiate NAFTA. Now, there's been so many mistakes between now and then, we kind of forget that our Prime Minister inserted us into something that was likely going to be focused on modernization with Mexico. But the Prime Minister did that, and later on, the U.S. outlined what they wanted. In July of 2017, the United States Trade Representative laid out a series of priorities for the U.S. They actually spelled out in detail, Madam Speaker, including things related to state-owned enterprises and non-market economy type structures. That was a surprise to people at the end. The U.S. laid it out in July of 2017, Madam Speaker, in detail, rules of origin, part content, the fact that they wanted to go after what they perceived to be subsidies in the agriculture sector in Canada, despite the fact the U.S. spends more on agricultural subsidies than we spend on our military, Madam Speaker. They laid out what they wanted to talk about, and what did the Liberal Party lay out a few months later in August 2017 at the University of Ottawa? The minister launched her vaunted progressive agenda speech, Madam Speaker. So there was no response to what the U.S. had already put out on trade. That's actually how a negotiation is supposed to work, Madam Speaker. They talk about the priorities they want to talk about at the table, and we put forward a contrary position. We should have pushed back and said the U.S. has to stop subsidizing their ag sector before they can lecture us, Madam Speaker, but they didn't do that. The Liberals actually proceeded to make it all, again, about the Prime Minister. The progressive agenda, they called it. And if you look at it, the speech, I invite Canadians, the core objectives of the minister's speech were laid out in detail. And they were failures across the board, Madam Speaker. So I know the minister has a high degree of education. If she was getting marked on her paper or on her speech, she'd fail, Madam Speaker. Let me take through the core objectives laid out by the Liberal Party at the beginning of NAFTA. First was to modernize NAFTA for the digital revolution. That did not happen, Madam Speaker, and in fact, there are concerns with respect to data transfer and localized storage of digital information that Canada was not able to negotiate into the new NAFTA. So first core objective was a failure. The second was the progressive section within NAFTA, Madam Speaker, where the minister, and later on the Minister of Climate Change and others, said they wanted clear new chapters on climate change, on gender rights, on Indigenous issues towards reconciliation, these sorts of things, Madam Speaker. Now, I said at the time, it's hard to be critical of things that are very important social programming and social policy issues, particularly reconciliation. I take that responsibility very seriously, Madam Speaker. But I also recognize that the NAFTA agreement is a trade agreement. There isn't even a constitutional alignment between First Nations and Indigenous peoples between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. So how could you ever negotiate a trade agreement with a chapter on Indigenous issues, for example, Madam Speaker? Of course, it was impossible. Why were those elements the second prong of Canada's NAFTA strategy? Because it's the Prime Minister's brand, Madam Speaker. That could have been ripped out of the 2015 Liberal election platform. But when we're putting up policies to make sure that we guarantee almost 2/3 of our economic activity as a nation, we should not be doing the posturing that they do on all these relationships. It leads to bad outcomes. The third core objective that the Liberal Party outlined was harmonizing regulations. That did not happen either, Madam Speaker. In fact, in the last government, we had the regulatory cooperation in the Western Hemispheric Travel Initiative, Beyond the Border initiatives. We've gone way back. We're not harmonizing any regulations. Fourth was government procurement and eliminating local content and Buy America provisions. They failed on that one too, Madam Speaker. There remain Buy American provisions, and in fact, it's a trend that's getting worse. Fifth of their core objective was to make the movement of professionals easier in terms of allowing Canadian professionals or people transferred for work to work easier in the United States. They failed on that front too, Madam Speaker. They did not secure that. That should have been low-hanging fruit. They didn't get that. And the sixth core principle was supply management, which they caved on as well, Madam Speaker. And what I never heard this government say was the fact that supply management system was criticized relentlessly. We heard President Trump talk about tariff rates and high tariff rates. I never heard a Liberal minister push back the United States to say their collection of direct ag subsidies amounts to more subsidization of the ag sector in the United States than in Canada by a country mile. In fact, they spend more on agricultural subsidies on average each year than we spend on our military. We should have been pushing back at this narrative, Madam Speaker. So those were the 6 core objectives of the minister's speech at the University of Ottawa. I'd invite Canadians to look at it. We did not achieve a single objective. If that's not failure of colossal proportions, I don't know what is. At the same time, we had 232 speculation about steel and aluminum tariffs. The Conservatives had said at the time, Madam Speaker, we needed to talk security, we needed to talk trade, we needed to make sure that we could use NORAD and other relationships that are unique to Canada as a way to make sure that we didn't have 232 tariffs applied. In fact, the Prime Minister did a Steel Town tour when they gained a 1-month exemption from tariffs, but a month later the tariffs applied, and they hurt Canada hard for a year. And if you look at the statements by Secretary Ross in the United States, we could have avoided it, Madam Speaker. In fact, Bill 101, which is before the House now on safeguards, is actually what the U.S. had been asking for. Had we aligned on concerns about oversupply of steel from China, had we aligned on security provisions, Madam Speaker, we could have avoided 232 tariffs and we could have had a better NAFTA trade agreement. In fact, Madam Speaker, at the time, the Conservatives publicly said to the minister, we gave advice on many occasions, use the North American defense relationship to distinguish Canada, because only Canada has a defense and homeland security partnership with the United States. Not Mexico, not Europe, not NATO. Only Canada does, and we've had that since the 1950s, Madam Speaker. So when we're talking trade, we're talking security, we're talking oversupply of commodities from China, we should have been aligned. In fact, oversupply of Chinese steel was something the Obama administration started taking on in the early days of the Liberal government, Madam Speaker, as the Obama administration was winding down. This was not all about it's hard to align with Trump. There was no attempt by this government. And if you look at the damage the so-called progressive agenda has done, Madam Speaker, it allowed Mexico to negotiate an agreement before Canada. In fact, it should astound Canadians that in the final months of negotiation, Canada was not at the table. Mexico was. 85 direct meetings with administration officials, even though Mexico was starting in a much worse position, Madam Speaker. In fact, the border relationship with Mexico was part of the US presidential election. But they were strategic. They didn't posture. They didn't virtue signal. They didn't try and run their next election using NAFTA negotiations as the stage. I can't stress it enough. On almost every major diplomatic entanglement we have under this government, it's the result of the Liberal Party putting their own election fortunes ahead of our national interest, ahead of steel workers, ahead of auto workers, ahead of the softwood lumber industry, which was hardly even mentioned by this government, Madam Speaker. We've seen those sectors, agriculture and others, let down time after time because of the Prime Minister's particular agenda and his desire to make this all about him. When it should be, in this Parliament, we should be serving Canadians, not the electoral fortunes of that party, Madam Speaker. So what has Mexico done? They've surpassed us under these Liberals, Madam Speaker. In fact, the first 2 months of this year, Mexico is now the largest bilateral trade partner with the United States. At $97.4 billion in the first 2 months, that was ahead of our $92.4 billion, Madam Speaker, even though they're caught in the trade disruption. Mexico has been smarter than this government has. So much so that they reached an agreement and Canada was given the option to join it. There was no further negotiations, despite the minister's frequent trips to Washington and storming into the building. The deal was done, Madam Speaker, and if you go to Washington, everyone knows that. The deal was done, Canada was given the ability to sign on. And now we hear them holding on to things like culture was exempted. Culture was never mentioned by the US once. It was not a priority in the minister's speech, or the Prime Minister never mentioned it. They're now trying to cobble together things they tried to say they saved. Chapter 19, which we already had that, and they were saying, well, culture wasn't changed. The Americans weren't trying to change it, Madam Speaker. I read through the 6 core objectives from the minister's speech. They failed on every single one. So, we've tried to work with them. In fact, the relief from tariffs, 232 tariffs, was initiated by the Conservative caucus, going down and saying we would work with the government on ratification. And the member from Malpeque knows that. He and many people are leaving because they don't like the way the Prime Minister approaches. I've lost track of how many more Liberal first-timers have resigned today, Madam Speaker. They don't agree with his approach. So we went down and said, we will try and use the dying days of this Parliament to pass a new NAFTA, even though we think it's a step back. We've called it, our leaders called it NAFTA 0.5, because we wanted those steel and aluminum tariffs off. They were hurting manufacturers in Ontario. They were hurting people in my riding, like Ranfar steel plants in Prince Edward Island that I visited last summer. They were being hurt in Quebec. So we made an agreement to say we will try and work with the government on ratifying a deal that we think is a step back just to get trade certainty. Businesses want some certainty, even if it means taking a worse deal. This will be a priority for us, Madam Speaker, because I want to end with remarks that are etched on the walls of the US Embassy in Canada. And we can let personalities get in the way on both sides, but it will be a priority for the Conservative government to get this relationship back on track. In 1961 in this chamber, John F. Kennedy said this: "Geography has made us neighbors, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. To whom nature has joined together, let no man put asunder." He said that in this chamber, Madam Speaker, and that's a challenge to us. These are our closest allies, trade partners, familial connections, going back to the origins of our country, Madam Speaker. We have to be able to fight for our interests, cooperate on security and trade, and to do that, the Conservatives wanted to work with the government to get the tariffs done, to work with the NAFTA agreement as we have it. We will fix the gaps after a change in government, Madam Speaker, sector by sector, auto, softwood, agriculture. But to get the certainty, Madam Speaker, we're prepared to try and work with the government, even though we would have taken a very different approach. I look forward to questions, including from my friend, the MP from Malpeque. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Windsor West.
Coming from the auto capital of Canada, Windsor, we've seen the trade relations erode, and we've seen our current footprint shrink, most notably in the last number of years. But I think it's important to recognize, and this is where my question will lead, it was actually 1965 when Canada got the Auto Pact in place. We had a trade deficit with the United States, despite the fact my region actually was the birthplace for the Canadian auto sector, having it actually developed with Detroit. Now, fast forwarding from 1965, we go from an auto deficit to the United States to actually a significant surplus that led to some consternation in the United States. And in fact, it was the Mulroney government of the Conservatives that killed the Auto Pact with the original NAFTA agreement. And that's the reality, Madam Speaker. And so what I would like to know from the Conservative Party specifically, what would their difference be with regards to these negotiations and the auto sector, and what they would actually have in this trade agreement, given the fact that it was the Mulroney government that actually got rid of the Auto Pact?
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member from Windsor. And as he recognized, I mentioned the Auto Pact in my remarks as the first example of sectoral free trade between two large industrial countries. And Canada did benefit in a large way. His area in Windsor, my area in Oshawa, places like Oakville, St. Therese, Mississauga, Aurora. It grew what became a Great Lakes basin of auto parts and auto supply and assembly, Madam Speaker. There's a number of reasons we've seen Canadian competitive erode in the last few years. This negotiation is one of them. I don't think U.S. free trade, in fact, some of the best years when that member was working in the auto industry came in the early 90s, Madam Speaker, where we had record levels of assembly with the United States, Madam Speaker, and I know he was part of that at the time. So what we're seeing now is protectionism with the U.S. We should have made sure that auto was our priority from the start. The fact that our minister did not mention auto as a priority in her core objective speech should concern Canadians. It should concern Jerry Dias, who was on the committee. Where was Jerry? Good question. Now they're putting him on other advisory committees, Madam Speaker, at least for the next few months.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Edmonton West.
Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. He made a comment about how the tariffs have been hitting our steel industry hard. I was looking at the PBO report, and two things stuck out for me. Last year, Liberals collected $1.1 billion more in tariffs than they actually delivered to our suffering steel companies. In their fall economic statement, they further forecasted the Liberal government were going to bank an additional $3.54 billion. $3.5 billion of tariffs, they were going to bank it instead of actually using that money to help our suffering steel industries. I wonder if my friend can comment on the duplicity of the Liberal government saying they stand behind our steel workers when they're actually just taking the money and putting it right in the bank.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Edmonton for his work. In fact, his office and himself knew the last budget and the errors in it better than the Minister of Finance and his entire department, Madam Speaker. I think the people of Edmonton should be very proud of the team we have there. It will be growing by 2 in a few months, Madam Speaker. The $3.5 billion in tariffs is part of our pushback on Bill C-100, Madam Speaker, because, look, the government did promise certain things in terms of tariff relief. When they imposed the retaliatory tariffs on the U.S., they knew it was having an adverse effect on Canadian producers and suppliers. In fact, I called some of them dumb because the minister had promised me she would adjust if those retaliatory tariffs were having virtually no impact in the U.S., but huge impact in our community. We all know boat sellers across the country, like the Junkin family in my riding. They've received no relief. They now have stranded inventory. So as part of our support for the safeguard bill that they're rushing through at the end, Madam Speaker, we've asked for a plan to get rid of that $3.5 billion. They're taxes that they've collected that are in their government revenues. It should go out to the small steel fabricators. It should go out to the boat retailers. It should go out to the SMEs impacted by their trade disruption. When are they going to dispense the money that these Canadian enterprises, particularly in Western Canada, so need so much?
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Malpeque.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I wasn't going up, but I couldn't resist because there was so much boom and bluster from the member for Durham that it provokes me to ask a question. The fact, and there's a lot of fiction and very few facts in his remarks here this evening. The facts of the matter are that we should be thanking the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the negotiating team for getting a pretty darn decent agreement at the end of the day. The Conservatives, on the other hand, in the initial stages of the negotiation, were taking the position, just cave in. Cave in. Give the Americans what they want. The member for Durham talked about supply management. Well, what did President Trump put on the table when he was speaking with those dairy farmers from Wisconsin, Madam Speaker? He said he wants the dairy system, the supply management system, gone in its entirety. That's not where we ended up. We saved the supply management. Yes, we gave a little bit of access. But we saved the system and we negotiated a good agreement for Canada.
L'honorable député de Joliette va avoir l'opportunité de demander une question. Je demande d'attendre l'honorable député de Durham.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm glad I provoked my friend from Malpeque to stand up. We are going to miss him when he retires shortly, Madam Speaker. But I would direct him, Madam Speaker, to McDougall Steel extractor, McDougall Steel in Borden-Carleton. Great people. They do know the member well, and they know he's been frustrated, Madam Speaker, because McDougall is a great example of a supplier that has worked together with companies in Quebec, actually working on buildings in Manhattan, Madam Speaker. This is amazing, where they can get specialized steel products made on Prince Edward Island to go into part of the bidding on a Quebec company's bid for a Manhattan skyrise, Madam Speaker. And what the tariffs were doing, under their watch when they allowed them to happen, they were pricing the Quebec extractor steel company and the PEI one out of North American supply chains. We could not have another year of companies like McDougall stuck out of these supply chains. That's why Conservatives are working with the government to get the tariffs off, and if it means a NAFTA 0.5, we'll fix it after the election.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Joliette.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente. Je tiens à remercier le député Durham pour son allocution. J'aimerais lui demander, là, on discute de l'ALENA, du nouvel ALENA. Le gouvernement a annoncé qu'il voulait l'adopter à toute vapeur. On se souvient que pour le partenariat transpacifique, on a entendu plus de 400 témoins lors des comités. Là, il reste 3 jours avant que, vraisemblablement, la Chambre ajourne avant les élections. Selon le député Durham, est-ce qu'il est question de faire un show de boucan préélectoral pour montrer à la population que le gouvernement fait justement son show de boucan pour faire semblant qu'il s'occupe de régler le libre-échange, ou selon lui, c'est plus un message qu'il envoie au président Trump pour dire « on s'en occupe, on va te rencontrer cette semaine ». Donc, c'est la question que je lui pose.
Honourable for Durham has just a little over a minute to respond.
Merci pour la question. Les accords de libre-échange comme l'ALENA, comme TPP, comme CITES, comme les autres, sont très importants pour notre avenir parce que on doit trouver des marchés autour du monde, Madame la Présidente. Et maintenant, nous avons des disruptions sur le commerce international entre Canada et les États-Unis sur les produits comme acier, aluminium et les choses comme ça. Donc, le Parti conservateur vont travailler ensemble avec le gouvernement si on avoir un accord normal et s'il n'y a pas de tarifs dans l'avenir. Merci.